I'm really happy to be here, virtually. But as Aaron mentioned, thank you, Aaron, for the generous introductions. My plan was to travel, but given the context of uncertainty, it wasn't possible. But I'm happy that Zoom and video call technology makes it possible for me to uh, participate in this really exciting conference. So thank you very much, Neil, and for the invitation, and Carlo also. I'm going to be presenting a draft article. This is work in progress of an article that I'm currently working on with two co-authors, and I will tell you. I understand I have 20 minutes, so I'll take my time so that I don't go over. Okay, so this this current presentation builds upon two of my core themes or areas of research. First, it builds upon my efforts to think about an expanded conception of extraction, one that starts from the assumption posed by Marx in the Grundrisse that a precondition of production based on capital is therefore the production of a constantly widening sphere of circulation. And on this basis, I have tried to understand the ways in which the production of the ways in which capitalist extraction presupposes an interconnected network of infrastructures for transport, logistics, finance, migration, labor, and so on, right? And my assumption here is that value is a methodological device for grasping global economic interdependence in two ways, right? First of all, the mine itself is a product of human labor, and we have to look at the technological organization of production as such, right? The machineries, infrastructure, the laboring body, and of course, the dynamics of class power that shape the site of extraction. Second, mobilizing value as a methodological device reveals the fact that capital, according to Marx, is value in process, right? Value, as Marx argues in the Grundrisse and also in Volume 2, is an incomplete entity that emerges in production but becomes realized in the sphere of circulation. So on this basis, I have tried to look at the relation between production and realization of value, also in line with the readings of the circulation of capital that have been developed by David Harvey, Christopher Arthur, and many others in the Anglophone literature. So one question that has emerged is, what are the contested and hierarchical forms in which value becomes realized and reproduced at the level of the interstate system? That is, at the level of an international division of labor. So my current work, and I include myself in this, has not been sufficiently or has not explored the dynamics of hierarchy that enable the realization of value at the reproduction of value at the world scale. So my recent work has entailed an effort to reconstruct the theories of development and underdevelopment that emerged from Latin America during the global Cold War, precisely because they elucidate these dynamics of power, hierarchy, and international subordination that make the global expansion and reproduction of capital possible. Okay, so my work, this presentation builds upon it and is intended to contribute to the vibrant new literature that gravitates around what is termed global extractivism, which has a series of assumptions, right? So it starts from the assumption that there are novel interconnections between extraction, finance, and logistics. Second, there is the assumption that it is premised on the monopoly control of the circuit of capital, right? Increasing concentration of corporate power and the ascendancy of the rentier class as a new driving force of social, spatial, and ecological change. And when I speak about the rentier class, I'm not only referring to the landed classes, but also owners of financial and intangible assets as well. I won't go into the literature, but there's a wide literature on the dynamics of rentiership and intangible or non-landed assets. Also, there is close intertwinement between private capital and state power on the basis of a new state capitalism that has also been, an important discussion. Also, the rise of China and of the BRICS signals the rise of the state as an organizer of globalized extraction, right? So there's also this kind of a more hemispheric geopolitical side of things. However, in this literature on global extractivism, the extent to which the monopolistic and state-driven dynamics of globalized extraction have also been underpinned by the hierarchical relations of the system of states is, however, yet to be more comprehensively theorized. Because, in fact, an underlying rationale of the literature on expanded readings of extractivism is a sort of methodological globalism in which circuits of finance and logistics are understood as operating parallel to or even beyond relations of power between rich and poor nation states or groups of states. So the material unity that brings together the global circulation of capital on the one hand and the political relations of interstate competition and domination on the other is hinted at or presupposed and not substantially explained. So what me and my co-authors are trying to do in this article is to suggest that it is the ownership and control of technology which lies at the basis of the relations of power that structure a world capitalist system in which primary commodity exporting economies are placed and maintained in a subordinate position. So, and in the graph, you can see, like the three stages, a periodization of three stages of dependence, according to Teotonio dos Santos and Marta Harnecker and Gabriela Uribe's intervention in 1972, which focused, like commercial dependency during the 16th century, financial dependency during the 19th century, the rise of the British Empire, and from the post-war period onwards, industrial and technological dependence. So what we are trying to do with this article is to take forward the specifically Marxist variant of dependency theory, Marxist dependency theory, to think about the role of technology in dynamics of global subordination. And for this reason, we propose the notion of international technological subordination. So what would a concept of international technological subordination look like? And of course, we've also, aside from thinking about the concept of international technological subordination, we have also looked at the empirical trends and dynamics and have developed an index that measures and assesses some of the dynamics of technological subordination. I'll show you some of the findings in a bit. But in the meantime, I want to delve a bit into the theoretical side of international technological subordination. So to begin with, unequal exchange has been an organizing concept for grasping the relation between extraction and international inequality. I mean, this is ever since, like the Prebisch-Singer thesis on the deterioration of the terms of trade, a concept that has been later picked up by contemporary frameworks of ecological economics, some varieties of world systems analysis. And it poses that, unequal exchange is the basis or the driving determination that explains and reproduces international inequality at the international scale. However, a theory of international subordination, international technological subordination, is intended to shift the focus from the unequal flow of value to the unequal structure of international production, right? And this is building upon into dialogue with some approaches that have proposed to shift the focus from value from exchange towards production as a central determination. So Marxist dependency theory proponents in the tradition of Marxist dependency theory argued that unequal exchange was unable to capture the full extent and the fundamental origins of industrial technological penetration in peripheral economies. So they argued it was not a question of exchange, but rather how international subordination becomes advanced and reproduced through international industrial penetration in peripheral economies, which become denationalized as a result of dynamics of foreign direct investment independent economies. I'll go into the details of this a bit later on. Also, an important element is that dependent reproduction cannot be disentangled from a simultaneous process of military integration. So according to Rui Mauro Marini, one of the canonical authors of Marxist dependency theory, was that monopolistic integration begets and like unfolds alongside a process of military integration as well. And I'll speak about how this process manifests in the under contemporary capitalism. So a noteworthy element in the framework of international subordination that emerged from Marxist dependency theory is that it was framed into dialogue with the Marxian theory of the circulation of capital, right? The global circulation of industrial technology. And in this beautiful map by also Marta Harnecker and Gabriel Uribe, you can see how like it portrays and shows like the global dynamics of industrial reproduction. So chief to this idea was the fact that there is like the concept of dependent reproduction. So as Latin American economies advanced the process of endogenous industrialization for the production of consumer goods, that is sector 2 in the reproduction schemes outlined by Marx in volume 2 of Capital, the need for machinery, fixed capital goods, and means of production broadly considered, that is sector 1 in Marxist schemes of reproduction, became more pressing. So in this way, Vania Bambira, also a theorist of dependency, framed this process as a process of dependent reproduction, because the development of sector 2 in the periphery becomes subordinate to and conditioned to the development of sector 1 in the core. And in that way, Bambira argued that dependent economies became sinks for equipment, capital goods, machinery, and instruments of production produced in like advanced or like imperialist countries, right? So the transnational and hierarchical integration between sectors 1 and 2 becomes evinced in the increasing levels of foreign industrial penetration, chiefly via foreign direct investment. Okay, so in the context, I mean, this like imbrication of monopolistic integration and military integration has become clearly evinced in the context of what has been termed a second Cold War or a new Cold War, chiefly between China and the US, especially as the mining industry and resource-based industries embrace the Industry 4.0 agenda. Because as the literature shows, what's characteristic in this sort of new Cold War is the fact that it does not gravitate so much over territorial control rather than on control over strategic technological sectors, of which, of course, artificial intelligence and all of the group of technologies that gravitate around the 4.0, the so-called 4.0 technological revolution are a key component, right? And China and the US compete on a global scale for the control of strategic economic or technology sectors, according to Schindler and other authors who have written about this emerging dynamic, right? Okay, so let's go to the empirical findings. So we built this it's titled Technological Dependence Index, TDI. It's work in progress, so I would hugely welcome any comments, suggestions, criticism that could enable us to strengthen this framework, right? So the Technological Dependence Index, what we did to build this index was to use the formula that the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, uses to measure food dependency. We replaced food, like cereal, specifically the FAO formula uses cereal to calculate food dependency. And we replaced cereal by technology imports and exports, right? And by technology imports, we mean capital goods. That is sector 1 in Marxist schemes of reproduction, right? So basically, you can look here. We work with the UNCTAD database, which has a really detailed list of specific technologies that are traded. You can see here a part of the list. We used a large list of closely to like 50 capital goods for resource-based industries. And by this, I mean energy, agriculture, and mining, basically, right? So you can see it's very specific, right? Like forklift trucks, other trucks fitted with lifting or handling equipment, self-propelled bulldozers, angle doors, levelers, scrapers, mechanical shovels, furnaces and ovens for roasting, melting, heat treatment. Anyway, so like very specific capital goods used in resource-based industries. So on this basis, just to give you an idea of how to interpret the data, so zero is, economies that score a value of the index in zero means that, like they are kind of equivalent in imports and exports, which means that they are kind of in a situation of autarky or close to autarky. Economies that are above zero are those that are net importers of technology. This means that they are technologically dependent from other economies that are net exporters of technology, right? So those economies that are below zero are those that export more capital goods than they import, and for that reason are more technologically autonomous, right? So here is this graph that shows a regional, like some stylized trends at the regional level, where you can see, for example, how in the Americas, for example, there are only 3 economies that scored values below zero. That is the US, Canada, and Brazil. The rest are above zero, which means that they are technologically dependent economies. So one striking aspect of this graph is the fact that it clearly shows the shifting architecture of power in the international division of labor, insofar as it shows China's staggering technological, transformation from the 1990s onwards has become increasingly autonomous in the production of technological equipment and capital goods. Whereas, for example, in Asia, Japan has followed the opposite route, right? It has become more technologically dependent. The United States, it clearly shows also, the kind of industrial and technological decline taking place in, what were erstwhile, important, technological powers, such as, of course, Japan and the United States, right? And in this way, and yeah, in Oceania, for example, there are only 2 economies below zero, New Zealand and Australia, and the rest of them are technologically dependent, so to speak. So I'll show you a closer snapshot. This is a graph that shows some of the 10 world economic powers, their performance in the index. This is TDI values, the index values for mining technologies exclusively, right? Where you can see, the kind of a similar trend taking place, right? China becoming increasingly technologically autonomous or independent, whereas other countries are either stagnant or becoming more technologically dependent. And you might argue that much of the technology exports of China might be produced with FDI, or capital from other countries, right? So kind of to think about the the problems that could emerge, we also looked at the data sets for patents, and this is patents for mining technologies, right? I mean, it's a clearly a striking trend that shows that sometime after the 2012 there was a radical transformation in a radical turning point in the patents for mining technology granted to China, whereas the United States has followed a kind of increasing, but not at a very different pace of technological advance. I also wanted to show, okay, so this is mining and agriculture, right? And we also did one for wind energy technology. We also did for solar, for solar energy, the results were not so different, right? So this is for wind energy technologies, where you can see one of the key differences is that Turkey plays an important role here. We would need some kind of more qualitative research or secondary information to see why why that is the case. Europe has been very stagnant in the production of wind energy technologies, which is of course along the lines of some of the secondary literature that shows that Europe has played a kind of a subordinate role to the global expansion of China as a global provider of capital inputs for the energy transition, especially wind turbines and engines, right? Which, like have been, uh, mm, China has specialized in the production of these kinds of technologies. Okay, so just to wrap up and to be precise with the time, I just want to think about what this data means for thinking about questions of international inequality, again by putting front and center not exchange as is often the case, but rather ownership and control of technology, and for that reason a production focused understanding of international subordination and international inequality. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to any comments or suggestions that you might have.
Thanks so much, Martin. And yeah.
Oh, hang on. Wait,
Oh,
I had Julia's first, but
Oh.
that's okay. Wait,
I could also go either way.
let's just find the beginning of news.
Slide to pause on.
This is your type, right?
That's my
Okay,
title.
great.
Although it's the formatting is off.
Oh, do we go to Google Slides? Is that what you use?
What's being terrible?
Let's try it. No, it won't be terrible. I just need the link, which is you sent it to me. I think I still have it. Hang on. This one there. Now go. Need to share that screen. Just this one. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. At the time. Uh, okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers for having me, especially Sachet for looping me in to this very exciting conference. So today I will be talking to you about pigs, specifically skinny pigs. So if you take a look here, in 1905, this was the winner of the Ohio State Fair, Miss Daisy, Poland, China. So in 1905, this was the ideal pig. 100 years later, this very abstract image named Symbol 3 is now the industry's portrayal of the ideal pig. So I, kind of just started out with the question of like, how did this happen and what does it mean? And to start with that, what does the skinny pig mean? I had to first think about, well, what does the fat pig mean? So both of these pigs derive the majority of their genetic information or foundation from Chinese domesticates. That's not what the slide's supposed to look like. Okay. So pigs were penned in China up to 6,000 years ago because they were primarily used as a source of manure. It doesn't make sense to pen pigs if you only use them for meat because they proliferate and they're fine on their own. And if you pen a pig, you have to feed it, you have to clean up after it. It's a lot of work, and this only makes sense if you have a big labor pool and very little arable land that cannot be let to rest. So just as proof of how early on pigs are domesticated in China, here you have a smiley pig from 3,000 years ago, and pigs don't smile like that unless they've been kept by humans for a long time. And also you have 2,000 years ago, people buried with, critical infrastructure like this toilet sty in which pigs lived. So the smallholders in China rarely got a taste of the meat itself. though lard was a primary cooking oil, and its flavor often graced the palate of an otherwise vegetarian diet. Instead of functioning as sources of protein, Chinese pigs operated as a kind of a broker of the balance between bodies and soil. The fat of their bodies a mirror for the fat of the land, both of which accumulated over the duration of their lifetimes, which lasted 1 to 2 to 3 years, depending on the market. And a reflection of this system, my very bad scribesmanship here, is the Chinese word for fat, which is the same as the Chinese word for fertilizer. So most intuitively, this taps into the concept of fat as a manifestation of abundance, applying the concept of energy store equally to land and bodies. But perhaps also embedded in this shared meaning is the implication that nutrition for bodies and nutrition for the land that nourished them depended on the same substance. So in present-day parlance, this substance would probably be referred to as nitrogen. The production of food is limited more by metabolizable nitrogen than any other plant nutrient, at least before Haber-Bosch, because even though nitrogen is essentially part of almost all biological processes, relatively few organisms are capable of incorporating or fixing atmospheric nitrogen into compounds utilizable by plants. Also, fixed nitrogen escapes quickly from soils and so requires constant replenishment. Now, Chinese pigs supported a diet based primarily on rice, vegetables, and soybeans. Rice and soy have found to be discovered to be useful not only for their high calorie to square acre ratio, but their capacity for returning nutrients to the soil. Legumes can self-fertilize via symbiosis, and rice cultivation creates anaerobic environments that encourage high rates of biological nitrogen fixation, or BNF, for those who read around this area. So this system was part of a delicate balance of energy and fertility and preserving them in land and bodies when both were at their limits. Now, Chinese pigs were imported into Europe primarily by way of Britain in the midst of a Western soil fertility crisis. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, European and American farmers struggled with overburdened soils. European farmers were so desperate for fertilizer that they raided Napoleonic battlefields, and like Americans were able to just capture islands in the Pacific for guano. And throughout this period, European and American agronomists bemoaned the fate of fertility under capitalist agriculture, repeatedly calling for the adoption of Asian methods of soil conservancy. Even Justice von Liebig, who is often called the father of artificial fertilizer, called China the birthplace of the experimental art. And he claimed that while the study of chemistry, the Arabic science, had enabled Europeans to surpass the Chinese in most realms, how infinitely inferior is the agriculture of Europe to that of China? So in this context, the importation of Chinese pigs can be seen as a transfer of agricultural technology from a more advanced society, accompanied by wider calls to further incorporate elements of the system from which they came. Though the margins were often thin, before Western competitive land grabbing culminated in the Haber-Bosch process, this system was one of the most defining examples, if not the example, of what sustainable agriculture looked like. But ultimately, European countries led by the British continued their reliance on land grabbing to continue their otherwise unsustainable agricultural needs. And the threat of supply chain disruptions amidst the rapidly depleting sources of the world's nitrogen accumulations incentivized the invention of synthetic fertilizer in Germany at the turn of the 20th century. We'll get back to the consequences of this in a second, but first I want to move to American pigs, who were also fat, but for very different reasons. So while Chinese pigs acted as a form of ecological redemption, returning the nutrients taken from the soil back to the earth, at the turn of the 20th century, American pigs primarily acted as carriers of an overwhelming surplus. Initially, American pigs helped settlers colonize the New World, set loose on the land to proliferate as a fast-growing and essentially free source of meat. Throughout the 19th century, scrappy half-wild pigs furnished the main source of animal protein for the American working class, from soldiers to settlers and the enslaved. But by the 1850s, their main function had become carrying the otherwise indigestible amounts of corn produced in the Midwest from bumper harvest after bumper harvest on the so-called virgin land. Americans were still more used to eating wheat, and domestic demand for corn fell far short of production. So without fat and Western pigs, the Corn Belt could not have existed. And without the Corn Belt, American agriculture could not have become the world-defining system that it did. So as a result of this system, cheap American lard flooded Europe. And eventually, in an attempt to protect their markets, Germany under Bismarck implemented protectionist policies to counter the effects of American products, eventually putting up trade barriers. This in turn rid Danish pork producers of their main market, so they pivoted towards producing for British markets. And ergo, we have our first lean pig, which by today's standards was not lean at all, but the British liked their bacon to be streaky. So these bacon pigs under Danish production were fed foreign feed and foreign stomachs, and this became like the industrial standard par excellence. So one kind of definition then of a lean pig is an export pig. If anyone here has read Fascist Pigs by Thiago Saraiva, they will know that pigs were bred to be fat under Nazi rule in the name of food sovereignty. Well, in the name of racial purity, but to serve the function of food sovereignty. So anyways, how did this trend spread to the US? Because there were export incentives to breed lean pigs in the US due to the British, but Americans tended to prefer lard-type pigs. And until the Second World War, the price of lard exceeded the price of pork. It was only after the war ended that the American pig industry was hit hard by a confluence of factors. So first was the rise in the popularity of edible oils derived from vegetables, first being the rise of Crisco, made from cottonseed oil, which is really a testament to how chaotic vegetables is as a category, because I don't think anyone considers cotton a vegetable. But anyways, it was marketed as a healthier alternative to lard, which was the everyman's cooking oil prior to the rise of hydrogenated vegetable oil. An interesting aside here is that the hydrogenation technology enabled both the rise of vegetable edible oils and like the synthesis of ammonia in the Haber-Bosch process. Something in the language in this Story of Crisco book that came out with the product, I would like to point out is that fat is hailed as the great energy producer. Now, fat is actually the most energy dense and energy effective form that food takes. Carbs are the quickest, and protein is unique. It's like nitrogen for plants in that it aids mostly in building or growth. And nitrogen exists in protein alone, not carbs or fat. So archaeologists measure nitrogen content in fecal matter and bones to determine the meat consumption of ancient societies. Anyways, just kind of putting the gloss on how nitrogen and protein both become fixations in this moment precisely because of their capacity to fuel growth at a biological level. So here now, pigs have lost two critical functions, the economical provision of fertilizer and the economic provision of fat. They have been reduced to nothing but a meat bag. Then, oh, that's supposed to be animated. Well, there's the picture that you saw at the beginning, desirable and undesirable, behind this graph. There's the post-war effects of Haber-Bosch technology being applied to industrial European farming, which causes US pork producers to lose critical amounts of their market, threatening domestic pork prices. And finally, there's shifting preferences amongst American consumers after the war. Precisely because pigs are such quick reproducers, pork was associated with war, slavery, and poverty in Americans' meat-based diet. So after, they were quick to shift from lard to shortening and from pork to beef and chicken. Repeated polling confirmed consumers wanted leaner meat. Of course, they're probably influenced by nutrition science ads that constantly harped on the negatives of animal fat. And in 1987, the National Pork Council spent $7 million launching the campaign The Other White Meat, which marked the culmination of 2 decades of tinkering with pig bodies to prioritize lean meat. So this was launched in the midst of the rise of boneless, skinless chicken breast, which was a totally new product born out of the fat phobia of the 70s and 80s. And as late as 2005, pork was still being advertised in relation to its favorable comparison with boneless, skinless chicken breast. And it was during this time, like the 90s, when pig breeders across the industry just hyper-focused on reducing the fat of pigs. Perhaps you will not be surprised to learn that these unprecedentedly lean pigs did nothing to slow the obesity crisis in the US, which had more than tripled since the 60s, and nor did they significantly boost domestic consumption. though many industry reps credit the campaign with keeping the industry afloat. But the true savior of American agribusiness after the post-war moment had to do with the global soybean complex that emerged in its wake. Another Chinese export, this soybean originally imported as a cheap source of protein in the early 20th century, but as you see here, soy exports skyrocketed after the 2000s. And this is because China joined the WTO with the explicit condition that they place an exceptionally low tariff on soybeans. Soybeans, like pigs, have been hacked from a land fatting technology into a technology of extraction. And a continuance of exporting the fat of South American land, soybean production is now also produced in the name of nitrogen or protein extraction. And where are all these soybeans going? Mostly China. And within that, mostly Chinese pigs, who have become also distastefully lean after the importation of artificial fertilizer plants, which was one of the first deals Nixon cut when he visited in '76. But I want to return for a moment to the US scene, because most of you in this room will remember, better than the other white meat campaign, the rise of bacon. So how did this happen? Okay. Pork producers remember pork bellies, the fattest cut of the pig, going for almost nothing in the 70s. There's reports of pushing it off onto food aid, practically giving it away to other countries because there was no market domestically. But the lean meat craze, which affected, also beef and poultry, resulted in tasteless meat, like McDonald's McLean, made of lean beef. Bacon became the saving grace of flavorless beef burgers and one of the longest lasting food trends of post-war times. So much that, boosted by a bacon boom, pork regained the top spot in the US meat consumption in 2015. Wow. So today, Americans' most preferred cut of pork is bacon, which comes from the belly, the fattest part of the pig, even though the world has been doomed to lean, tasteless pigs, also because of American anxieties. So there's a few takeaways I have from the story, and I'm really interested in hearing any that you might have. I know I've touched on many subjects. But to use metabolism as a metaphor for capital flows, which is kind of how I'm understanding it being used in this conference, lean pigs play a critical role in the metabolism of the petrostate. But from a pig perspective, the accelerated hacking of pig bodies fueled by fossils has been an anti-metabolic process. And this breaking of cycles manifests itself in the bloated and polluted bodies, be they human or land or water or pig. Well, no, actually pigs reflect the bloatedness of the bodies they're serving today. The petrostate pigs of today also act as a balancer, but one for the tumultuous grain and fuel markets, not fat stores, the leanness of their bodies belying the overfat bodies they balance out for. Speaking of metabolism, literally, higher fat consumption also increases the body's capacity to store nitrogen and protein. So petrostate pigs emerge from a system that treats time's accumulations as an unlimited resource, a system that fundamentally relies on breaking further into earthly layers and land grabbing. The kind of productivist consumerism that emerged in the wartime, bolstered by nutrition science, the way supply-side economics bolstered export markets, produced this power diet predicated on protein consumption, which is a diet with a growth fixation. Eating meat has become a duty masquerading as a privilege. And you can see this in the many medical attempts to recommend Americans eat less meat and how that is constantly retranslated into less fat by the time it hits congressional approval. And that's one takeaway. The next takeaway is in the rise of bacon as this lonely carrier of flavor in the otherwise totally desolate landscape of lean meat, despite what consumers told producers they prefer, is a mark of a collective wish for more time, more seasons for flavors to accrue. Mark Fisher has noted how it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. All I know is a better society would have fatter pigs.
right on schedule. And yeah,
Okay. I'll try to keep us there. Once my slides get up. I will say this is the first time I'm presenting this set of thoughts. They're kind of new. I recently defended my dissertation and I'm now thinking about thinking about how to make it bigger and better and more ambitious and draw its implications out further geographically and temporally. So my area of expertise is socialist Czechoslovakia and coal mining under socialism, obviously. And when Suchad wrote to me about this conference, I was like, I'd love to present, but what I know is socialism, and not really capital flows, and extraction, not really metabolism. But then I thought harder, and I was like, I do actually know a profound moment of a creation of capital and its metabolism through the global economy, which is post-socialism. So there is a narrative that state socialism was an environmental catastrophe, which does have quite a bit of truth to it. This is usually explained by its hyper focus on industrial production, steel production, inefficiencies in mining enterprises and the provision of fuel for the population. And I would also say that this hyper kind of energy intensive socialism succeeded in raising the quality of life for millions of people. There's mass electrification, universal housing, a right to heat, which, as we heard, did not or was contested maybe more in Britain, and universal education and healthcare, full employment. So socialism was fossil fuel intensive, just as capitalism was and is. But I think it would be a huge mistake to take that to mean that the energy systems of socialism and capitalism had the same goals. They're both intense, but for different ends. So the collapse of socialism looks a lot like decarbonization. So I'll give you some examples of that, which is, well, as you'll see, largely because of a transition from coal to natural gas or oil. This is Russia, Czech Republic, which is my area, the rise in nuclear power. All of the nuclear power stations in the Czech Republic and Slovakia were actually conceived and built during the socialist period. So it's not really a capitalist decarbonization, but it gets framed that way. Bulgaria, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, which is kind of a random example, but I'm going to talk about it more. Declines in the consumption of fossil fuels in all of these places. So we know that there was a decrease in the production of fossil fuels, largely because of the decommissioning of coal mines and coal-fired power plants. But the value stored in those firms did not disappear into thin air. And it was not distributed equally to the people who had created it with their labor. But where did it go? Nobody really seems to know. And that is quite deliberate because for the most part, it got ferreted away and hidden. So this is my rough schematic of the differences between capitalist energy firms and actually existing socialist energy firms. I'm aware that even in capitalist states, many energy firms are state-owned, and this is not a sort of perfect binary. But I think it is important to emphasize the difference that capitalist energy firms exist kind of foremost to generate return on investment for shareholders, and then to provide fuel to customers, right? Like the category of the customer is paramount, and if you can't pay your bill, you don't get your heat. Socialist energy firms, on the other hand, existed above all to serve the goal of full employment. And then secondarily, I would say to provide fuel to the nation. So the category of the customer was not quite as relevant, even, though there were prices and Sorry, I didn't even set my timer, so I have no idea how long it's been. But it was nominal. As a percentage of average income, energy prices were quite low, at least in Czechoslovakia and Central Europe throughout the socialist period. So many of the social benefits of socialist citizenship were distributed or accessed through the workplace, which is why full employment is so important. And these things included lunches, housing, vacation. So this is my case study, I guess, the one particular firm, OKD, Ostravsko-Karvinsky Doly, in the Ostrava area of Czechoslovakia, now Czech Republic, the hard coal mining region. And these are some of the perks of employment in OKD during the socialist period. This is a recruitment poster. You know, it advertises differential wages for married and unmarried workers, housing, crucially leisure. So trips to the beach are a perk of employment. Oh, this is 1976. Yeah. Medical care, so trips to the dentist. This is a coal miner getting his teeth examined. Housing, crucially, and childcare. This is a nursery, all part of this coal firm. These are all of this infrastructure is owned by OKD. The beach, recreation in the Beskidi Mountains. These cabins also in the Beskidi Mountains. These are the wives and girlfriends of coal miners and a child, you know, whose bottom you can see. This is my favorite example of this. This is a beach camp in Bulgaria called Cosmos, which was owned by this Czechoslovak coal firm for the exclusive recreational use of miners. And they had mandatory vacations to the Black Coast every other year as a like preventative health measure. This is in Czechoslovakia. These were cabins in the Beskidi Mountains. Other cabins that miners could visit for free. You know, here's a coal miner. I think this is a pensioner, you know, enjoying the fruits of his labor in retirement. So this no longer exists. And we might, sorry, I'm catching my place in my notes. So the process of privatization had to deal not only with coal reserves and not only with coal extraction infrastructure, but also with this enormous social infrastructure. So it was not such a clear-cut thing and kind of ontologically challenging to translate a socialist energy firm into a capitalist energy firm. And I did a lot of archival work in the corporate archives of this firm during my dissertation. And, you know, it's very interesting to read the transcripts of the meetings in which this coalition of people is trying to decide whether to keep, for example, the Bulgarian seaside resort as part of the, you know, the newly privatized OKD, if it could generate profit or if it should be, you know, eschewed. And ultimately, it was decided that these, you know, all of these forms of leisure and care were too expensive and impossible to maintain in a profit-generating system. So they were shed. So the privatization process of this firm was very complex, and a lot got okay, yeah, that's an important little aside, so I'm going to make sure everybody can see it. So how exactly did it happen? In Czechoslovakia, there was a system of privatization done through vouchers. So each citizen could buy a booklet of vouchers, which they could use to purchase shares in formerly state enterprises. This is in retrospect, kind of widely seen as a really dysfunctional system, because what happened was unregulated investment firms cropped up as intermediaries between citizens and their vouchers. So most people, put their money into a, pseudo mutual fund, usually operated by some, a con man, and then lost it. So with OKD, the guy who kind of siphoned up all of the vouchers first was Stanislav Peros, and then with a cohort of other guys, gained majority ownership in the company. And then it was purchased by another firm called Carbon Invest. There is a missing 2 billion crowns at this point. And then Carbon Invest was bought by a businessman named Zdeněk Bakala under a firm called RPG Industries. We have another missing 23 billion crowns, which is, millions of dollars. And crucially, all of these firms that cropped up to be the parent company of this formerly socialist enterprise are not local. So Carbon Invest is headquartered in Cyprus. RPG Industries is also headquartered in Cyprus. Cyprus is continues to be the preferred tax haven of East European oligarchs. So the irony of this story is that OKD was recently renationalized because it was going to become bankrupt. So the Czech government purchased it in 2018 for 0.2% of its value, of the value that it was estimated to have in 1992. So this is a process of asset stripping, and it is not a geographically neutral one. Now, yeah, this guy, Zdeněk Bakala, is kind of the face of this in the Ostrava region, because he's the most well-known. His home is in South Carolina, and so basically, like, the capital was extracted, and it now is invested in sites of leisure in the United States. Another example, which I want to include just to show that this kind of there's a similar pattern maybe for socialist firms that weren't privatized in the same way. So the oil fields of Azerbaijan are really robust, and you could say Azerbaijan is currently a petrostate in the prosaic sense, not in the more complex sense that Dominic was arguing for last night. But there's a big scandal a few years ago where a group of investigative journalists uncovered the so-called Azerbaijani laundromat, where revenues from the state oil fund were traced kind of through this global network of bribery and influence. So I am going to wrap up with a few of my big takeaways. The first one is that world historically, there have been lots of fossil fuels extracted and burned, not in the service of capital accumulation or profit maximization. This isn't a novel point, but I think it is worth repeating, because the logic that motivated socialist energy firms was perhaps more sympathetic, building a better life for working people. And this is quite a challenge. I think it's a moral challenge to us. The second point is that the so-called great decarbonization of post-socialism had profound social costs. It also produced new and staggering inequality and the advent of fuel poverty. A lot of people in Hungary, for example, remember the 1990s mostly as a period of being cold. And the third and probably biggest takeaway I would like to give you is that post-socialism was a global financial event. We're used to considering it as a national or a regional financial event, but the movement of capital created by socialist firms overwhelmingly did not stay in the places where it was produced. And the spatial pattern to this movement of capital mimics others. Maybe Vanessa Ogle has written about decolonization as a financial event. But in this case, the value originated under the conditions of socialism through the collective efforts of thousands of people and was expropriated by a very small number of investors. They mostly spend this money far from its points of origin here in the United States, in Western Europe, and there's also a lot of it in the United Arab Emirates and other sites of wealth. So anyways, my point here is that much of the fossil capital circulating through the world's tax havens and special economic zones is in fact socialist.
Okay, fantastic. We have plenty of time for questions. So I think as was true last time, I'll kind of collect them in clusters as the conversation evolves. So Manoush and Lale in that order.
Thank you. So my questions are from my ignorant enthusiasm on all of these topics. One is for Martin. I think what I wonder is that your equation talks about the balance of import and export, but I'm still wondering about the crucial kind of material dependencies that even if in one situation the export and import are balanced, but it's still some of the material might completely collapse the system. In other words, I see your formula as a representative of kind of global vulnerability. In addition to the topic of inequality you're talking about. So I wonder if that is correct or not. And then for Neil, it's about my really surprise at the fat fear of US nation. So everything is fat free. And as a person from Middle East, I come here and since like 2009, like, why everybody is so obsessed about fat? Like yogurt is fat free. What's the point of eating yogurt if it's fat free? So, but at the same time, it completely ignore kind of acceptance of sugar. So a lot of things are extremely sweet. Sweet. Yes, like nothing. Even eggplants are sweet. Arbolas are sweet. Like everything is extremely sweet. So I wonder in your story how this kind of a story of sugar, parallel story of sugar and fat has been in the US.
Okay, just Lale, before we get there, Martin, were you able to hear Mehanush's question well enough that you?
Yes, I mean some parts of it. If you want to, because apparently she's a bit far from the microphone, so if you could kind of like point some of the key highlights of the. But I understood part of it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the question was sort of about kind of beyond the numbers of import and export balances. What about kind of forms of material dependence that could kind of exceed the abstract logics of the hierarchy?
Great. Yes. Perfect. No, I got it.
That could destabilize. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'll encourage everyone to speak loudly so that I don't have to function as mediator. So Lale, yeah.
I'm obsessed with food, and one day I'm going to do some sort of a project on food. And so this was absolutely fascinating, not just because, of course, fat is the thing that flavors everything, but also because I was really interested in the circulation of the aesthetics around food. So that the fact of taste, which is an aesthetic element, circulating from the US and imposing itself like so much else American imperialist on absolutely everybody else. But a question that I have is that this circulation also happens with China, with soybeans and pigs, you know, the between the US and China. in places like Italy or Spain or France, there has been an industrialization of food, the kind of the ridiculous, skinless, boneless, blah, 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 tasteless. But there has also been, not through any kind of planning, but a preservation of localized forms of production that is not as energy intensive, that preserves the flavor, et cetera, et cetera. And it has now translated into the whole slow, well, 20 years ago into the slow food movement. I'm curious about whether the kind of a dual system also emerged in China, and whether or not this was also this kind of a dual system in which forms of localized production were maintained, was then co-opted by the luxury food markets. Yeah, thank you.
Why don't we take one more?
Thanks. My question goes to Julia. I wondered, I'm really interested also in that question about how the energy economy works differently under socialist stuff, but I work more on the Soviet Union, and I wondered whether, because you've made the difference between the two on the firm level, and I agree with you that those firms work differently, but you could also look at it at the level of the nation state or even the world economy, and then wonder, and this probably goes more towards your dissertation than what you presented now, but coal mining since the 70s was probably somehow related to the price of energy and how it affected the payment of those countries. So I wonder whether you could reflect on how it might have been capitalist or mediated through a capitalist world market before the situation of political economy.
Okay, why don't we take responses in reverse order, just as a matter of equity. So, I mean, Julia, do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah. I think, thanks for asking that. So I mean, I think one could argue that the collapse of socialism in Central Europe anyways was precipitated by the oil crises. I mean, so again, Czechoslovakia is the context that I know best. And after the suppression of the Prague Spring in 1968, there was a permanent price freeze on gasoline, home heating, and electricity costs. As this has been interpreted as a sort of pacification, of a politically restless population. But I actually think it's it's a concession to a demand for cheap and reliable energy that was made much earlier and is very much in line with the socialist project. But that kind of, it hamstrung the state, especially later on as global energy prices increased rapidly in the 1970s. So my understanding is that the fix of this was taking on loans from West European banks. So because there's there couldn't really be a decrease in the consumption of energy and specifically oil products in socialist states without losing political legitimacy. And oil became much more expensive on the global market. Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland all took on bigger and bigger loans to import more and more oil, which undermined the whole system. So I would say on the level of the state, excuse me, I would draw a distinction between socialist energy policy and capitalist energy policy, but they are inseparable ultimately. Excuse me.
Yes, thank you for both questions. They're really things. So sugar, I've thought a lot about fat versus protein because of pigs, and sugar I think is a great third thing to add to that. I mean, it's the end product of carbs. So in the terms of like building and then in store, sugar is like the fast-paced currency of the three. But I have not read enough about the sugar lobby. I assume for some reason they have more sway than the pork guys who are constantly just getting hammered by everyone else within this food industry. As for localized production, I think here it gets at the complexity of what is being negotiated on the plate and what, like, how laden our roles as consumers actually is, because consumer preferences are, from one perspective, the guide of industry developments. But on the other hand, like, how conditioned a consumer populace has to do with all sorts of things like collective experiences of hunger and the way in which like food is reintroduced. For instance, spam has this incredibly rich afterlife, or I don't know if that's even the right word, but in like the Pacific world, where people like imprinted on this item as like their first access to a cheaply available meat. And it's still like a celebration, even though in the US context, it's seen as like a ration and like a sign of poverty. And the same thing can be said of pigs in general, because of their proliferate nature, but because of their role in Asian agriculture, there continues to be a culture of celebration around the pig. So Chinese consumers, definitely, there's like a really strong memory of how pigs used to taste. And that's hunger plus better pigs together, creating this yearning. But like you suspect, it's definitely become manifest in like a kind of boutique culture, which has also made its way in the US. And there's this whole like black pig thing now, and it's supposed to be better and taste better because black pigs are better. But actually, it's because at least a pig breeder in China told me she thinks it's just because they grow slower. So the equation is actually very simple. And even though like, so American consumers are kind of like, the article on the rise of bacon, at the end, the pork exec is like, I don't think they even know it's pork. Like that's the kind of comprehension American consumers are assumed to have about their meat. Whereas in China, people have very like lived experiences. They remember what rice tasted like when the manure was organic, and they're like, nothing tastes like that rice. And so it's not a problem of consumer preference anymore, or like over conditioning, but rather like the conditions under which meat became available were explicitly through these like global standard, like the role was that of like kind of a export market. So even though China like was really like placed a big emphasis on kind of some kind of food sovereignty when it came to pork, they're completely reliant on imports for feed. And I think that is a really powerful transmission of what food actually ends up tasting like. That plus the fact that you have similar, kind of problems of urbanization, because you have this kind of notion that with upward mobility comes more consumption, but then also you move less, and getting too fat becomes like a fear. So I think that's also being negotiated on the plate as people claim to want leaner and leaner meat. Yeah.
Martin?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, it might seem paradoxical to say that that our theory of international technological subordination is focused on production, and we are like basing our argument upon a formula that looks at exchange, right? And I will explain a bit what this means. So the FAO like calculates food dependence using metrics of exchange as a proxy for production. I mean, because there is no standardized data sets that can offer, like a really, like a good grasp of how, like production has evolved. Then the FAO methodologically has used this kind of, like exchange metrics as a proxy for understanding production. And other indexes have taken a similar route. For example, the Economic Complexity Index, which also uses the UNCTAD database, uses trade as a means to look at, like what are economies producing, right? And to look at, like precisely the kind of material. So I'm going to the, just, like this is a long route to say that, like, yes, I mean, thinking about the material dependency, we're trying to look at the material dependency through data on exchange, as a proxy for production. So this means that, like countries, and our data shows that are some countries that are extremely dependent on the technological advances and inputs and capital goods coming from other countries, right? And again, like this is, and the question is the formula representative of global vulnerability? And I would argue, like this is a good question, one that I wouldn't know how to answer precisely, but one would think that a country that is highly dependent on the technology of other countries perhaps faces, I mean, this is clearly what happened. I'm thinking about, like Julia's brilliant presentation of the collapse of, like the socialist system, when, like the Iron Curtain fell. Cuba was extremely dependent on capital goods and imports from the Soviet Union, and entered, one of its most severe crises, right, after 1990. And again, it speaks to how, like material dependence in like technological dependence could be a real problem for economies.
Okay, we can take another round of questions. So I think, Joy, did you have yeah, and then Michael and over here. Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm gonna question for Martín, and I was really.
Here, Joy, will you can you come up just so that he can hear you?
Where should I announce my?
Right here, yeah.
Yeah, I think the question that I wanted to, it's the camera.
It's over here.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, great, fine.
Hi, I can see you.
Hi, thank you. I was really taken by the sort of, I mean, I'm thinking with the sort of, the claim that you were making about these kind of, the conscription of sort of primary producing countries into these sort of transnational supply chain networks or something like that. And I think I was maybe thinking about in what ways is the kind of the sort of structuring methodologically of the data at the level of the national economy, to what extent does it successfully capture the ways in which those sort of supply chains do or don't track kind of nation state boundaries? And so I think in particular, I'm thinking about the one kind of category from a sort of dependency theory perspective is the category of the multinational corporation, and the ways in which that's the kind of agency mediating these kind of unequal technological exchanges. And so I suppose if I have to kind of formulate it in a short question, sort of to what extent, what does the sort of data at the level of the national economy, what might it obscure about the ways in which these relationships are being mediated?
Yeah.
So the question is for the big talk. Yeah. I'd like to talk because again, I'm not sure it except for this thing that sort of mediates all these various relations, it says historical and ecological relations over the course of the history that you laid out there. So I'm interested in if you've encountered in any of your work sort of the limits of what the pig can do. So where the pig as this mediating apparatus collapses, and what the effects are of that collapse. So the pig is sort of this, the thresholds of the pig is mediated.
Yeah.
I also have a question for Martin.
Come on over. Yeah.
Hi, Martin. Thank you for your talk. I have a kind of a pedestrian question. Maybe I misunderstood, but what are the normative or political implications of your TDI formula? Because there's one way to read it in which you're giving us very specific analysis of the relations of dependence in a global context of an unequal division of labor. There's another way to read it with the same limits of dependency theory from the 70s, which is that what you're calling for is just in 2025 import substitution industrialization again to limit dependence. I suspect you've thought about this, and so I wonder. I suspect you also have an alternative, and I wonder if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's a good place to take responses. Martin, do you want to go first this time, and then?
Yeah, thank you. Well, really great questions, actually. Thank you very much. Okay, so first, like the methodological aspect on, like what does like the data, like at the national aggregate level obscure? And this is a really fundamental and relevant question because, like like the tenet of Marxist dependency theory is that, like production has been denationalized, right? Because of, like FDI and, like the industrial technological penetration by transnational corporations, as you rightly mentioned, right? So clearly, like the data, the aggregate data at the national level can and definitely obscures some of these aspects, we think, and that's precisely why we try to like kind of triangulate the data for exports and imports with data for patents, right? To try and think about, like to what extent is, like the production in each of these economies triggered by endogenous technological advance and in those economies, right? And for example, the data on, like China kind of goes hand in hand, like the export data in China really like goes hand in hand with the the like the behavior of its patents, right? The patents that have been granted to China. So again, like and we don't have, again, like data for at the subnational scale. So that's why I think a mixed method approach could work really well, because when you look at, for example, specifically in the case of China, like the world systems analysis literature shows that sometime around the first decade of the 21st century, there was a kind of a qualitative shift in the productive apparatus of China, where it was no longer, like this kind of maquila system, like producing with foreign technology, right? It kind of shifted towards a kind of its own indigenous technological framework and apparatus that really transformed the nature of the exports, which you can see. And for example, the studies on the auto industry in China, for example, precisely show this, right? That it was no longer working with, like foreign technology, but it was producing with its own technology. So this is why I think, like a mixed method approach could work really well to give some kind of the kind of nuance that the aggregate, like data might be obscuring. And second, the political implications for the TDI formula. This is a really fundamental question, I think. Unfortunately, I couldn't touch upon this on the presentation, but this is a part of the work that I'm currently doing right now. And the more historical work, we're trying to reconstruct the history of nationalizations, right? Like the idea, like, because, like the question of technological dependence went very much hand in hand with the question of with the program, the political program of nationalizations. And we're looking at this through how nationalizations appeared in the instances of internationalist organization from the third world, specifically tricontinental and the non-aligned movement. Because like debates over resource nationalization in these like frameworks of internationalist organization were very much like ingrained with debates on technological sovereignty. And it was believed that nationalizing strategic resource areas and industries would provide the lever for for applying an industrial policy that could shift away from primary commodity export dependency. And so this is, for example, the rationale that followed the nationalization of copper in 1972 in Chile, but also, like other and broader cases such as the OPEC, right, which we could argue whether they were successful or not, but they were oriented by this vision of like technological sovereignty. I don't want to like extend too much, but that's part of where we are going with this, to look at nationalizations.
Could I respond?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay. I feel like, we're talking about China, we're talking about technology, and we're using very different definitions or even concepts of it. So I just kind of wanted to respond for a second to these are just some things for you to think about. I don't know that you can necessarily do anything with them, but I referred to Chinese pigs as agricultural technology. I referred to soybeans as agricultural technology. They were not protected by IP when they were incorporated, and now they are sold back to China. So I think this actually strikes on what Lali was talking about with like what is happening in the technocracy of accounting for value here. And this is something that I think your work is amazing, but it could maybe be bolstered with like a focus on one kind of technology to show how it exists in tandem to these other things, like, you know, some kind of key thing like oil or something. And also just from a historical perspective, technology as we know it, like the pig is a accumulation of dealing with the problem. The Haber-Bosch was the reaction to a dramatic scarcity. Like, so I guess I'm just curious to whether there's a place in your thinking about technology that takes into account that it's often a response to some kind of lack. And I don't know if it makes sense to think about the history of technology when you're working at such a broad scale, but it is a question that comes to my mind. And thank you so much for asking about the pig and whether it has limits. I mean, you saw that 2,000-pound pig, right? You saw that. And today's pigs, guess how long it takes for them to reach market weight? And guess what that weight is? Okay, I won't make you guess. 6 weeks?
6 weeks.
Wow, that's like chicken level. No. Yeah, right. Yeah. 4 to 6 months to reach 250 pounds.
Oof.
Just, you know, weird. And pigs, you know, they kind of assumed their form like 45 million years ago, and they've basically maintain their design. So there's a part of me that just thinks pigs are the perfect design. Like omnivore, monogastric omnivore, and like just so does a pig have limits? I think so when you talk about where the body breaks down, huh?
Mediate, where it can mediate on this.
Yeah. So where the body breaks down can be seen in the slaughterhouse, and it's actually the human bodies that exhibit the clearest signs of breaking down. Humans are so intimately, I mean, to Robert Suit's point about automation, so intimately part of every crevice of pig slaughter, despite the crazy kind of degrees of mechanization. And this includes like rescuing piglets from at birth, and this includes artificial insemination, like literally recreating the backs and pheromones of a boar to, you know, induce like more fertility. All this is to say that I'm just astounded by what the pig can do and how it mirrors the society and the kind of relations that it engages in. Like Germans have this whole romance of the noble, brave boar, because that's what they were like when they were living in the forest and being hunted. Chinese have this like docile, fat, super polite, super part of the family pig that also emerged from a different set of relations. You have islanders who like take piglets, blow powder in their face to make them forget their mother, and then suckle them at their own. Like there's so many ways to incorporate pigs, and I think part of that is because pigs and humans have such interchangeable sources of energy. And anyway, so it's really in the like chronic pains sustained by slaughterhouse workers that I see the body breaking down, because the pig keeps getting pushed faster, more, you know, leaner. Yeah,
The human is the limit to the pig.
I would say so.
All right, I think Robert had a question and one way at the back. So yeah.
I had 2 questions, but Ian, you just answered my question on temporality of pigs, so great. For Julia, I wondered maybe I missed it, but I was wondering what you saw as the relationship between like the sell-off of fossil capital assets and the material crash in production that we see of fossil fuels in like post-Soviet.
Okay.
Wait at the back. Yeah.
I also have a question about pigs and the limits of pigs, but it's more about like the
unlimitedness of pigs. I couldn't stop thinking about during your talk about the literature on feral pigs, especially in like colonial America, and how like they kind of form these sort of colonial beast assemblages. Mainly like English courage, for example. And then these, there are these Chinese pen pigs that you're talking about that, as you said, like took over the world via the British in the 19th century, also through their colonial expansion. And then there's the shift to these skinny pigs and their own kind of version of like neo-imperial assemblages kind of. I was just wondering like how you imagine this like image, the changing image of the feral pig and anxieties around that, as well as like these colonial assemblages.
Then Neil.
This is for Martín, actually.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Martín, thank you so much for the brilliant presentation. So this is inspired by your reading of Mondale, which because you are reading Mondale very carefully, I've been going back to Mondale and I was thinking about his analysis of machinofacture, which he argues, as you know, is essential to the dynamics of surplus value extraction and capitalist imperialism in the moment of late capitalism. And in a certain way, I read your analysis as a further elaboration of that concept, because your whole account is about the ways in which, capital goods are part of this dynamic of, imperialist inequality within the current moment of the new international division of labor. So that's a bit of a rabbit hole for folks who are interested in these kinds of things. But I think that's the whole issue of like machinofacture in the developmental dynamics of capitalism and how that articulates to your theory. But maybe more specifically to the theme of the conference, I wanted to draw you out on the energetic dimensions of this, because to some degree, one could argue if you do like a fossil capitalist reading of Mandel, the development of machinofacture is basically the further lock-in of fossil-based infrastructure and machinery to support the broader kind of turbine of capital accumulation. Because all of machinofacture, I mean, he even says this in a footnote, it's basically powered by different forms of oil and steam. So what does this mean? So there's a lot, but basically just can you reflect on, I mean, it would require maybe a more specific data analysis from the data that you've got on, the infrastructures related to so-called renewables that are also within these uneven international circuits. In other words, the continued export of technology that's basically oil and fossil fuel based versus various circuits of whether it's wind or solar. And that also raises questions about whether renewables technologies could or should be nationalized and developed through obviously locally controlled metabolic circuits. So I see that as kind of like a layer of your analysis that one could draw out perhaps in further articles or in another chapter of your book if you want to. It's obviously connected to agricultural technology as well, to the degree that we want to continue to have fossil food versus agroecology and so forth. Anyway, that's a whole jumble of thoughts, but pick out whatever might be useful. I'd love to hear you just draw out the energetic dimensions of these technologies and their possible pathways. Thank you, as always.
Okay, and as a gesture to the embodied metabolism, so all the people in this room, each of you will have 1 minute to respond to these questions, and then we will break for lunch and hopefully continue the conversations in other formats. So why don't we wrap in the order that we started? So Martín, you, and then Julia.
Wow, thank you very much. Really difficult to answer in 1 minute, but yes, like the machinofacturing and energy nexus, I think is fundamental. And actually writing this article has made me think about the dynamics of energy dependence and think about, I've been actually thinking about in a second paper would really where I look at some of these, trends, especially to look at, capital goods for the energy industry and how to look at them in dialogue or, relation with, the actual exports of energy, energy as a consumer good, right? Oil, natural gas. And it would need, actually, and the good thing about the TDI, the Technological Dependency Index, is it could be applied to, like different, like technologies or, like exports, right? And then I'm also, like referring to what New said. Thank you for the suggestion, New. I think it would be great to narrow down, and especially like focusing on one, and you could apply the index. The idea is to apply the index for, like it could be a narrow one technological object. So yeah, I don't want to, like go beyond the 1 minute. So thank you.
Okay, super quick. Thank you for the question. There's kind of two responses I have. One is that a pig, no matter how many generations it's been domesticated for, can go wild like immediately. Like you release a piglet and it's like tusks, bristles, like let's go. So the whole like the kind of wild domestic distinction is actually kind of impossible, and people kind of go back and forth about it. But in my mind, it's like you just don't know. Pigs are, unless you pen them continuously, which is what happened in China. And that brings me to my second point about the ferality as assemblage. And it just makes me want to think about the personality of American pigs, which are, according to Chinese farmers, not very sociable. They don't mesh well with society. They're like, they don't care about their kids so much. So it's just like, at some level, these traits, like they are definitely picked up from their trajectory. So on the one hand, I'm saying like all pigs are feral, but on the other hand, I'm saying like the pathways they take definitely does influence like what they bring in more than just meat ways.
Okay. What is the relationship between the selling of assets of socialist fossil firms and the material decline of fossil fuel production and consumption in post-socialist states? So, energy firms scaled down and stopped producing so much coal and oil to a degree, but especially coal. Everybody agrees on this. The question is why. So economists say that this was because of efficiency. These firms were inefficient. They couldn't produce a profit, so the market decided that they must close. Political scientists might say that they closed because these states had new access to the global energy market, better alternatives. So it's sort of a variation on the efficiency argument. Environmentalists might say that they closed because of new EU carbon regulations, aspirations to join the EU, and their like strict regulations about environmental conditions. What I am saying is a major reason these firms stopped producing so much and closed down is because of a very deliberate process of asset stripping by their new owners. A desire to extract the wealth created by socialist laborers, for their own ends.